On the morning of November 13, 2022, an ordinary college house in the quiet town of Moscow, Idaho, became the center of one of the most shocking murder investigations in modern American history. Just after 4 a.m., inside a 3-story home on King Road, most of the residents appeared to be settling in for the night. But according to investigators, something was terribly wrong. One surviving roommate would later tell police that she had been awakened by unusual sounds coming from inside the house. At first, she believed nothing was out of the ordinary. Then she heard what sounded like crying. Moments later, she opened her bedroom door and came face to face with a man dressed in black, wearing a mask that covered his mouth and nose, walking past her and toward the home's sliding glass door. Then everything went silent. Hours later, 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, would be found dead inside the King Road house. The murders sent shockwaves across the country. Who had entered the home that night? Why were these 4 students targeted? And how could a crime of this magnitude happen in a quiet college town where violent crime was almost unheard of? For weeks, investigators had no publicly identified suspect, no murder weapon, and a community living in fear. But what investigators would eventually uncover would transform this case into one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in recent American history. And according to investigators, the person responsible may have left behind a single piece of evidence that changed everything. If you enjoy in-depth true crime documentaries, be sure to subscribe to Dark Crime Casefiles, where no crime stays in the dark. This is the story of the Idaho student murders, and what investigators believe happened inside the King Road house on the final night of Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan's lives. To understand how investigators eventually identified a suspect, you first have to understand the place where this tragedy unfolded. Because before it became one of the most infamous crime scenes in America, the house at 1122 King Road was simply home. Located in Moscow, Idaho, a small college town near the state's western border, the King Road neighborhood sat just minutes away from the University of Idaho campus. Moscow was known for being quiet, close-knit, and safe. Violent crime was rare, and for many students, it was the kind of place where doors were often left unlocked and people rarely felt the need to look over their shoulders. For years, students had chosen Moscow because it offered the kind of college experience many young people dream about. Football games, fraternity parties, late-night food runs, and lifelong friendships. And sitting on a hill overlooking much of the surrounding neighborhood was a 3-story rental home that had become a popular gathering place among students. The house at 1122 King Road wasn't unusual by college town standards. Friends came and went regularly. People stopped by unannounced. Social gatherings were common. It was a home filled with activity, laughter, and the constant energy that often comes with student life. Inside the house lived 6 young women. Among them was 21-year-old Kaylee Goncalves. Kaylee was described by those who knew her as energetic, ambitious, and fiercely loyal to the people she loved. She had recently graduated and was preparing to begin a new chapter in her life. In fact, she was only visiting Moscow that weekend to spend time with friends before moving away for a new job in Texas. One of those friends was Madison Mogen. Known to many simply as Maddie, 21-year-old Madison had been best friends with Kaylee for years. The two were inseparable. Friends often describe their bond as more like sisters than friends. Maddie was remembered as warm, outgoing, and someone who had a way of making people feel comfortable wherever she went. Also living at the King Road house was 20-year-old Xana Kernodle. Xana was known for her vibrant personality and infectious energy. She was studying at the University of Idaho and was in a relationship with Ethan Chapin. Ethan, also 20 years old, was a member of the university's Sigma Chi fraternity. Friends described him as kind, easygoing, and deeply devoted to his family and friends. Ethan was one of triplets, and those close to him often spoke about the strong bond he shared with his siblings. Also living in the home were roommates Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, both of whom would survive the events of that night. Together, the residents of the King Road house represented something familiar to millions of people: friendship, youth, and the excitement of college life. But on the evening of November 12, 2022, As friends gathered, messages were exchanged, and weekend plans unfolded. No one inside that house could have imagined that they were living through their final hours. And before the night was over, everything would change. For everyone inside the King Road house, it seemed like an ordinary Saturday night. Across Moscow, Idaho, students were doing what college students do on weekends, meeting friends, attending parties, and enjoying a night out. At the King Road house, life appeared completely normal. But investigators would later spend months reconstructing every movement made that night, piecing together what would become the final known hours in the lives of 4 young students. Earlier that evening, 20-year-old Xana Kernodle and her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, attended a social gathering at the Sigma Chi fraternity house, located just a short walk from the King Road residence. The couple spent much of the evening there with friends, enjoying what, by all accounts, was a typical college night. Meanwhile, best friends Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen had gone out together in downtown Moscow. Surveillance footage and witness accounts would later show the two visiting local businesses before eventually making their way to a popular late-night food truck known as the Grub Truck. Shortly after 1:40 a.m., cameras captured Kaylee and Madison standing near the food truck, chatting with friends and waiting for their order. The footage would later become some of the last publicly available images of the two alive. Nothing in the video appeared unusual. The friends laughed, talked, and waited for their food, seemingly unaware that these ordinary moments would soon be analyzed by millions of people around the world. At approximately 1:56 a.m., Kaylee and Madison left the area and accepted a ride back to the King Road house. Investigators believe the pair arrived home shortly before 2 a.m. Around the same time, Xana and Ethan also returned to the residence after leaving the Sigma Chi house. By roughly 2 a.m., all 4 victims were back inside the King Road home. The surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, had already returned earlier in the evening and were inside the house as well. As the early morning hours approached, the home gradually became quiet. Or at least, that's what everyone initially believed. Investigators would later determine that activity inside the house continued well into the early morning. Then, at approximately 4 a.m., according to court documents, Xana Kernodle received a DoorDash order delivered to the King Road residence. That seemingly insignificant delivery would eventually become one of the key reference points investigators used while reconstructing the night's timeline. Because according to investigators, sometime after that delivery arrived, everything changed. Authorities believe that during these same early morning hours, someone entered the King Road house. What happened next would transform a quiet college town into the center of an investigation that captured the attention of the entire nation. And according to investigators, the crucial events that followed would unfold in just a matter of minutes. By shortly after 4 a.m., all appeared quiet inside the King Road house. The lights were off. Most of the residents had either gone to bed or were preparing to do so. Outside, Moscow was beginning to settle into the stillness that often comes just before dawn. But according to investigators, sometime during these early morning hours, someone entered the home. Exactly what happened inside the King Road house that night may never be known with complete certainty. Much of what investigators believe occurred comes from a combination of physical evidence, digital records, and statements later included in court documents. According to investigators, the first indication that something unusual was happening came from one of the surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen. Dylan would later tell investigators that she had been asleep when she was awakened by what she initially believed was Kaylee Goncalves playing with her dog on the 3rd floor. At first, nothing seemed alarming. In a house where multiple roommates lived and friends frequently came and went, late-night noise was not uncommon. But a short time later, Dylan reported hearing what she believed was one of the roommates say something to the effect of, "There's someone here." Investigators would later suggest that this statement may have come from Xana Kernodle. Concerned, Dylan opened her bedroom door and looked outside. She didn't see anything unusual. Believing everything was fine, she closed the door and returned to her room. Moments later, she said she heard what sounded like crying coming from Xana's room on the 2nd floor. Then, according to the probable cause affidavit, she heard a male voice say something to the effect of, "It's okay. I'm going to help you." Once again, Dylan opened her bedroom door. Still, she saw nothing. But the sounds inside the house had become increasingly unsettling. Then came the moment that would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the entire case. After opening her door for a third time, Dylan told investigators that she saw a figure dressed in black clothing and wearing a mask that covered the person's mouth and nose walking toward her. The figure, she said, had bushy eyebrows and walked past her in the direction of the home's sliding glass door. According to investigators, the individual did not appear to notice her. Dylan later described herself as standing in what court documents referred to as a frozen shock phase as the figure walked by. Moments later, the person was gone. And then, according to investigators, the house fell silent. Exactly what occurred during those critical minutes inside the King Road residence remains known only to the person responsible. But by the time the sun rose over Moscow, 4 young students had lost their lives. And for several more hours, no one outside that house knew that anything was wrong. Because inside the King Road home, tragedy had unfolded in complete silence. Students were waking up, making plans, and going about their day, completely unaware that one of the most devastating crimes in the town's history had already taken place. Inside the house, however, confusion was beginning to grow. As the morning went on, attempts were reportedly made to contact some of the roommates. Messages and phone calls went unanswered. At first, there was no reason to assume anything was seriously wrong. After all, it had been a Saturday night. College students often slept in late, and the house itself was known for having people coming and going at all hours. But as more time passed, concern began to build. At some point before noon, friends were called to the King Road residence. Exactly what was seen or said inside the house during those moments has never been fully made public. But what is clear is that something was terribly wrong. At 11:58 a.m., a 911 call was placed from one of the surviving roommates' phones, requesting help for what was described as an unconscious person. Within minutes, officers from the Moscow Police Department arrived at the house on King Road. What they found inside would change the town forever. As officers moved through the residence, they discovered 4 victims: Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. All 4 had been killed during the early morning hours. The scene that greeted investigators was unlike anything the community had experienced in recent memory. Within a short time, the area surrounding the home was sealed off with crime scene tape. Police vehicles lined the street. Investigators began arriving. Forensic teams entered the house. And word quickly spread that something terrible had happened. At first, details were scarce. Students gathered in disbelief. Parents began calling their children. Rumors spread across social media. Many people assumed there had been an accident. Others feared something far worse. Then came the announcement that would send shockwaves far beyond the small college town of Moscow. 4 University of Idaho students had been found dead. The news was almost impossible to comprehend. A house that had been filled with friendship, laughter, and ordinary college memories less than 12 hours earlier had suddenly become the center of a homicide investigation. For the families of the victims, life would never be the same. For the University of Idaho community, a sense of safety had been shattered. And for investigators, the questions were only beginning. Who had entered the King Road house? Why had these 4 students been targeted? And where was the person responsible? As news spread across campus, fear quickly replaced shock. As investigators worked to process the scene at the King Road house, fear began spreading throughout Moscow. For many residents, the news was almost impossible to comprehend. Moscow was a town of just over 25,000 people, known more for its university community and small-town atmosphere than violent crime. Homicides were rare. A crime of this magnitude was virtually unheard of. And yet, somewhere in the community, a killer was still unaccounted for. Within hours, national media outlets had descended on Moscow. News vans lined the streets. Satellite trucks filled parking lots. Reporters from across the country arrived, transforming the quiet college town into the center of one of the most closely watched investigations in America. At the University of Idaho, shock quickly gave way to anxiety. Students who had once felt safe walking through campus at night suddenly found themselves questioning everything. Many parents urged their children to come home. Some students left campus altogether. Others avoided going out after dark. The sense of security that had defined college life in Moscow had been shattered. As the days passed, fear only intensified. Investigators had confirmed that 4 students had been murdered inside their own home, but despite the unprecedented scale of the investigation, there was still no publicly identified suspect. And perhaps most unsettling of all, police initially stated that they believed there was no ongoing threat to the community. The announcement immediately drew criticism. Many residents struggled to understand how investigators could assure the public there was no threat when the person responsible had not yet been identified or arrested. As public concern mounted, investigators later clarified and, in some cases, adjusted their messaging, acknowledging that the situation remained complex and that many questions still needed answers. The confusion only fueled speculation. Social media quickly became flooded with rumors, theories, and accusations. Friends of the victims, surviving roommates, former acquaintances, and even complete strangers found themselves the subject of intense online scrutiny. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, investigators were facing enormous pressure. The families wanted answers. The community wanted reassurance. The nation wanted to know who had carried out the murders. And with each passing day without an arrest, that pressure continued to grow. But while the public searched for answers, investigators were quietly pursuing thousands of leads, reviewing countless hours of evidence, and piecing together what would become one of the most extensive homicide investigations in Idaho history. Behind closed doors, investigators were assembling an enormous amount of evidence. As fear gripped the community, investigators began what would become one of the largest homicide investigations in Idaho's history. The scale of the case was enormous. Detectives from the Moscow Police Department were quickly joined by investigators from the Idaho State Police and the FBI. Together, they launched a massive effort to identify the person responsible for the murders. In the days that followed, investigators worked around the clock. Tips poured in from across the country. Every lead had to be examined. Every possibility had to be considered. According to authorities, investigators eventually processed thousands of tips, conducted hundreds of interviews, and executed numerous search warrants as they attempted to piece together what had happened inside the King Road house. The investigation generated an extraordinary amount of evidence. Detectives reviewed cell phone data, examined digital records, analyzed forensic evidence, and painstakingly collected surveillance footage from homes and businesses throughout Moscow and the surrounding area. Investigators were essentially attempting to reconstruct an entire night, minute by minute. And slowly, a picture began to emerge. One of the biggest challenges facing investigators was determining how the killer had arrived at the house and, more importantly, how they had escaped without immediately attracting attention. To answer those questions, detectives turned to surveillance cameras. They collected footage from residential security systems, businesses, traffic cameras, and any other source that might provide a clue. Investigators reviewed countless hours of video. Then they noticed something. According to court documents, surveillance footage captured a white sedan repeatedly driving through the area surrounding the King Road residence during the early morning hours of November 13th. The vehicle appeared to make multiple passes near the house before eventually leaving the area at a high rate of speed shortly after the estimated time of the murders. Investigators believed the vehicle could be critically important. As they expanded their search, additional surveillance footage allegedly captured the same vehicle traveling along roads near both Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington. Detectives began mapping the vehicle's movements. Camera by camera, street by street, minute by minute. The investigation that had once seemed almost impossible was beginning to narrow. Then, on December 7, 2022, investigators took an unusual step. The Moscow Police Department publicly announced that they were searching for the occupants of a white Hyundai Elantra manufactured between 2011 and 2013. Authorities stated that the individuals inside the vehicle might possess information critical to the investigation. The announcement immediately captured national attention. Within hours, images of white Hyundai Elantras were appearing across television networks, social media platforms, and news websites around the world. tips flooded in. People everywhere began searching neighborhoods, parking lots, and college campuses, hoping to spot the vehicle investigators were looking for. But while the public focused on the car itself, investigators were already digging much deeper. Because according to investigators, identifying the vehicle was only the beginning. Behind the scenes, detectives were combining surveillance footage, forensic evidence, and digital data in an effort to reconstruct the movements of both the killer and the vehicle before, during, and after the murders. And as they layered one piece of evidence on top of another, investigators say a pattern began to emerge. According to court documents, investigators first turned their attention to a white Hyundai Elantra registered to a man named Bryan Kohberger, a graduate student studying criminology at nearby Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, just a short drive from Moscow. But investigators needed more than a vehicle registration. They needed to know where Kohberger had been. To answer that question, detectives began analyzing cell phone records. According to the probable cause affidavit, investigators obtained records associated with a phone allegedly belonging to Bryan Kohberger. What they discovered, investigators say, was significant. According to those records, the phone had allegedly utilized cellular resources that investigators believed were consistent with the device traveling in the vicinity of the King Road residence on multiple occasions prior to the murders. In fact, investigators would later allege that the device had been near the area of the King Road house at least 12 times before November 13th. Most of those visits, according to investigators, occurred during the late evening or early morning hours. Authorities would later argue that these alleged visits suggested a familiarity with the area surrounding the victim's home. But it was the phone's activity during the night of the murders that investigators found particularly noteworthy. According to court documents, the phone associated with Kohberger allegedly stopped reporting to the cellular network shortly before the murders occurred. Investigators say the device stopped communicating with the network at approximately 2:47 a.m. Then, for roughly 2 hours, there was no cellular activity. According to investigators, the phone did not reconnect to the network until approximately 4:48 a.m., less than an hour after the murders are believed to have taken place. Investigators would later suggest that the device may have either been turned off or placed into airplane mode during that time. But the digital evidence didn't stop there. Using surveillance footage collected from businesses, homes, and traffic cameras across both Idaho and Washington, investigators say they were able to track the movements of the white Hyundai throughout the early morning hours. Camera footage allegedly captured the vehicle leaving the Pullman area and traveling toward Moscow before the murders. Additional footage then allegedly showed the vehicle making multiple passes near the King Road residence during the timeframe investigators believe the murders occurred. Then, shortly after 4:20 a.m., surveillance footage allegedly captured the vehicle leaving the area at a high rate of speed. From there, investigators say they tracked the vehicle as it traveled south of Moscow before eventually returning to Pullman. Individually, each piece of evidence may not have seemed conclusive. But together, investigators believed they were beginning to see a clear picture emerge. A vehicle, a cell phone, a timeline, and according to investigators, all of it appeared to be pointing in the same direction. But investigators say the most significant piece of evidence had been waiting at the crime scene all along. But detectives still faced a critical problem. Circumstantial evidence alone would not be enough. Investigators needed something that could physically connect a suspect to the crime scene itself. And according to court documents, that evidence had been there from the very beginning. As investigators processed the King Road house, they recovered a tan leather knife sheath lying on the bed next to Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves. Stamped on the sheath was the insignia of the United States Marine Corps. At first glance, it may have seemed like just another piece of evidence collected from an extraordinarily complex crime scene. But investigators would later describe the sheath as one of the most important discoveries made during the entire investigation. Because attached to the button snap of the sheath, forensic analysts reportedly identified a single source of male DNA. Investigators immediately began working to determine who that DNA belonged to. However, finding a match would prove difficult. The DNA profile, investigators say, did not initially produce an identification through law enforcement databases. So detectives continued building their case. Meanwhile, as the investigation into Bryan Kohberger intensified, authorities began quietly monitoring his movements. By late December 2022, investigators had tracked Kohberger to his family home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, where he had traveled with his father during the university break. According to court documents, investigators conducted surveillance at the residence while continuing to gather evidence. Then came the breakthrough. Investigators recovered trash that had been discarded outside the Kohberger family home. According to the probable cause affidavit, forensic testing later determined that DNA recovered from the trash belonged to the biological father of the individual whose DNA had been found on the knife sheath. Investigators concluded that the person who left DNA on the sheath was statistically extremely likely to be the biological son of the man whose DNA had been recovered from the family's trash. For investigators, it was a pivotal moment. The vehicle evidence, the cell phone data, the surveillance footage, and now, according to investigators, there is DNA evidence. Individually, each piece of evidence told only part of the story. Together, investigators believed they had identified the person responsible for the murders. Investigators now believed they knew exactly who they were looking for. The focus of one of the largest homicide investigations in Idaho history had narrowed to a single individual, 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger. At the time of the murders, Kohberger was a PhD student in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at nearby Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, less than 10 miles from the King Road house. Originally from Pennsylvania, Kohberger had earned both his bachelor's and master's degrees in criminal justice before relocating to Washington to continue his studies. According to those who knew him, Kohberger had a long-standing interest in criminology and the study of criminal behavior. Years before the murders, he had reportedly participated in online discussions about psychology and crime. And while attending Washington State University, he was pursuing advanced academic research in the field. Court documents would later reveal that investigators had identified a white Hyundai Elantra registered to Kohberger, matching the type of vehicle they had publicly asked for information about weeks earlier. According to investigators, the discovery further strengthened their growing case. But as news of Kohberger's alleged connection to the investigation became public, the reaction was immediate. For many people, the revelation was startling. The idea that a doctoral student studying criminology could allegedly become the prime suspect in one of the country's most closely watched murder investigations captured international attention. Media outlets from around the world descended on both Moscow, Idaho, and Pullman, Washington. Former classmates, professors, neighbors, and acquaintances were interviewed as journalists sought to understand who Bryan Kohberger was. Some described him as quiet and reserved. Others said they had little interaction with him at all. As public interest intensified, online speculation exploded. But despite the intense scrutiny surrounding the case, it is important to remember that, under the American legal system, Bryan Kohberger is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty in court. Investigators, however, believed they had gathered enough evidence to take the next step. In the early morning hours of December 30, 2022, the investigation that had consumed an entire nation reached a dramatic turning point. More than 2,000 miles away from Moscow, Idaho, law enforcement officers surrounded a home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. Inside was 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger. According to authorities, investigators had spent weeks quietly building their case while conducting surveillance at the residence after Kohberger returned home for the holiday season. Now they were ready to act. Shortly after 1 a.m., members of the FBI, Pennsylvania State Police, and other law enforcement agencies executed a search warrant at the Kohberger family home. Bryan Kohberger was taken into custody without incident. Later that same day, authorities publicly announced that a suspect had been arrested in connection with the murders of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. The announcement sent shockwaves across the country. For nearly 7 weeks, millions of people had followed the case, wondering whether investigators would ever identify the person responsible for the killings inside the King Road house. Now, there was finally an arrest. But for many, the questions were only beginning. In the months that followed, The case continued to dominate headlines as court hearings, legal filings, and newly released documents provided the public with a clearer picture of the investigation. Prosecutors have outlined a case built on multiple forms of evidence, including surveillance footage, cell phone records, vehicle analysis, and DNA recovered from the knife sheath found at the crime scene. The defense, meanwhile, has challenged aspects of the prosecution's evidence and has maintained Bryan Kohberger's innocence. As with any criminal case, the burden remains on prosecutors to prove their allegations in court beyond a reasonable doubt. And because many details have yet to be fully examined in open court, public debate surrounding the case continues. Some believe the evidence made public thus far strongly supports the prosecution's case. Others argue that important questions remain unanswered and are waiting to hear all of the evidence before reaching a conclusion. What happened inside the King Road house during the early morning hours of November 13, 2022, continues to haunt not only the families of the victims, but an entire community. For the city of Moscow, Idaho, life would never truly return to what it was before. For young lives were cut short. Countless family members, friends, classmates, and loved ones were left searching for answers. And a quiet college town became forever linked to one of the most widely discussed murder investigations in modern American history. Years after 4 University of Idaho students were killed inside the King Road house, the events of that night continue to raise questions, fuel debate, and haunt a community forever changed. If you found this investigation informative, share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. And if you enjoy in-depth true crime documentaries, be sure to subscribe to Dark Crime Case Files, where no crime stays in the dark.